Welcome to the C.S. Lewis Festival Scholar Series. I'm your host, David Crouse. Today's Zoom interview is a freewheeling interview with renowned poet, author, singer-songwriter, Anglican priest and academic, Reverend Dr. Malcom Guite from his home in England. My interview with Malcom ranges from his upbringing in Africa to his discovery and love of poetry. Included his personal reflections on C.S. Lewis and a family connection to Lewis as well. Then throw in Jerry Garcia, Dante, Keats, Shelly, John Lennon, and his memorable encounter with Paul McCartney. It was one of the most enjoyable interviews I've ever had in my career. I hope you agree. And now, Malcom Guite.
Okay.
So welcome, Malcom. It's great seeing you again.
It's great to be in conversation again.
Yeah, it's the world of Zoom. Who knew, right?
Yes, exactly. It's strange. We meet on this flat screen, which is a great deal better than not meeting at all, but not quite so good as sharing a pipe or a pint together in an actual room.
I still remember from 2018 sharing a pint with you on a wonderful cruise that we had on Walloon Lake, which is in Northwest.
That was truly memorable. As you know, I love boats and boating and lakes of any sort, bodies of water. So that was a particularly blissful evening for me.
It was for all of us. And we had cornhole, which is a uniquely, well, maybe not uniquely American fan sport for the college set. And you and Michael Ward had a go at it, and then we put her down.
We unveiled a competitive streak in Michael Ward. Very good.
Well, for our viewers, this had to do with Michael Ward and Malcom Guite's appearance here, and I'll use a UK phrase, in the hamlet on Little Traverse Bay, Petoskey, Michigan, on this great inland sea called Lake Michigan. And it's an annual festival that we have had. Now we're going into our 18th year. And you two have known each other. You and Michael have known each other, but you had not really been together to speak.
Yes, that's right. We go right back to Cambridge days. And I remember when Michael Wood was doing the research and making the astonishing discoveries that led to his book Planet Narnia, I can remember sitting with him in the deer park at Peterhouse in Cambridge, hearing him talk about this with great enthusiasm and thinking, gosh, I'm the first to hear this, one of the first. It was wonderful. Yeah, so we've known each other for some time, and we've been involved with a thing for preserving G.K. Chesterton's library, for example, together. And we'd actually written essays for the same book, so we'd, as it were, been published together, but we'd never actually done any kind of joint speaking. And it was great. We're very different characters, of course. I wonder, we're one of those friendships that, I think it's what Lewis calls the second friend. The first friend is the person who agrees with you about everything, and the second friend disagrees, but about similar things, and so he's, I think people probably quite enjoyed he's got a Tremendously kind of correct and restrained style of presentation.
Yes.
I sort of throw my arms around and gesticulated wildly, so.
Well, I thought it was appropriate we started the festival, and then we'll move into our actual sit down. We started it at Beard's Brewery, a local brew pub here in Petoskey, and you had a wonderful concert that night. We had a wonderful turnout as well, and you and Michael up on stage. Michael Ward, by the way, is a gifted scholar for our viewers who are not familiar with Michael Ward. His book, Planet Narnia, is still in print, and you can purchase it through a variety of sources. We promote local independent booksellers. But anyway, it turned out to be a wonderful, wonderful festival. So, it's interesting when we got together, and granted, we were only together for 3 days. Your life story is truly very unique. And you were born in Africa and to missionary parents.
Well, my father was in fact a classicist, a professor of classics, but also a very active Methodist local preacher. And he was lecturing in Ibadan University in Nigeria but at the same time also, preaching widely on a circuit there. And so I was born out there in 57 and spent, I spent the first 7 years of my life in Nigeria, and then another 3 in Rhodesia, as it was then, Zimbabwe as it is now, before we left Africa.
Was the Civil War, were you affected at all by the Civil War?
No, we left, as it were, just as that was kind of boiling over. But Dad loved Nigeria, and so do I. Have very happy memories of it. He always maintained that the two things he was there for, he was a classicist, and as I say, he was a Methodist preacher. But he reckons that both classics and Christianity were in some sense refreshed and given back to him by his Nigerian students and colleagues. The classics, because they were still, living in a quite strongly animist culture where the ancestors were everywhere, as it were. And, Chinua Achebe, in fact, was one of my father's students. And so My Life in the Bush of Ghosts and so on. And he felt when you were reading the account, say in the Aeneid of Aeneas going and finding the golden bough and going down to talk to his father and get the sort of guidance of his ancestors, whereas that's a sort of classical trope and is all very distant and learned for the English scholar, that the Nigerian student, his dad used to do just that. And they were in some senses living closer to him. If you go back behind Virgil to Homer, my dad reckoned that they were closer to the heroic age than any students he'd ever had. So they had a new take on the classics. But he also found himself he was brought up as a Methodist in Yorkshire in the north of England, and the discovery that you could be a Christian, and indeed a Methodist Christian, without necessarily having buildings with pointy arches and singing the hymns the way you used to sing, but it made a distinction between Christ and culture for him. And he found the African culture enormously restorative for his own sense of the universality of his faith.
Well, how did this then impact you? What have you taken in your life from those early years in a distinctly African culture?
Well, I think a lot of things. One thing is the way things were working out there. I mean, my mother was doing a little bit of work in university as well, and I had a lovely Yoruba nurse. I have a Yoruba first name. Everybody calls me Malcolm, but my first name is actually Ayodeji. Ayo meaning joy, and Deji meaning again or a second time. So second joy. It's a traditional name for a second child. And I had a wonderful Yoruba nanny who took me everywhere as an African woman would, bundled as a baby or, even just as a toddler sitting on her back or whatever. So I went to all the markets and all where the women were gathering and singing their songs and, pounding their grain. And so I was immersed in that. And then when I went to school, it was multi-ethnic, multicultural, all the children from the faculties of the university. So I mean, white kids were in a minority, which is pretty quite useful for a white kid to be. And so I grew up with a sense of different languages and cultures. But of course, African culture is very much about community, storytelling, mutual belonging. I remember years later talking to a Ugandan student when I was at theological college, and he was saying, we would never have a philosophy that begins like your Descartes, who says, I think, therefore I am. We would say we belong, therefore we are. So I think I learned something about community, about I had bits of Yoruba that I could speak. I mean, I can't do it now. I could have just say hello and goodbye basically now, but I mean, so that was very rich. And then of course, when we moved to Zimbabwe, we were suddenly in a very different culture. That was still when it was under Ian Smith and was not quite as apartheid as South Africa, but moving in that direction. And in fact, they illegally declared independence while we were there, UDI, and in order, in a sense, to be more oppressive. And my father found himself in opposition to a government which he regarded as illegal because it had seceded from the Queen. And so I also learned at quite a young age, between the ages of 7 and 10, that not that I really understood all the politics, but I understood that what my parents had taught me about what is fair and about treating people equally and about, the things they taught me about how I should behave to other children had implications for how the grown-ups should behave to each other. And so I think another thing, interestingly, obviously my parents were culturally British and deeply soaked in Shakespeare and Milton and loved poetry. And my mother in particular had a great source of poetry. So I was already imbibing a lot of English literature and poetry almost just accidentally, even while I was out in Africa. but I was in another place. But when I came back to England, when I realized I was in some senses an Englishman and went to school in England and eventually came to Cambridge, much as I loved and felt a kind of return to that culture, on the other hand, I just saw it slightly differently. I had another perspective. And I think that other perspective sometimes helps. I think it helps particularly in that one of the things I would say it stops you from doing is rushing to judgment or absolutizing your own first assumptions about either the world or anybody else. There's more than one way of seeing things, and that's quite useful. I think I bless my parents for that, really.
Well, I hear that. I hear you saying that, and I see that referenced in your poetry as well. I think of it, your formative years, you have now left Africa and you are in a distinctly Western culture. What kind of a transition was that for you? Was it hard? Was it difficult?
Well, I got used to sort of moving, and at first I found England strange and cold, both climatically, but also to some degree culturally and emotionally. I didn't learn English reserve. I had to acquire a little bit of it as a survival, strategy, really. What happened was we were in England for a little while after Zimbabwe, but then Dad got a job in Canada. But then
where in Canada?
In Hamilton, Ontario. He was a professor of classics at McMaster University there. But in about 71, when I was, 13 or 14, I guess, my dad, I was going to high school, and my dad just didn't feel the Canadian schools at that stage or where we were very good. He also was very afraid I was losing my English identity. And he sent me back to school in England. And I went to a boarding school, to a sort of traditional English, you'd call independent. Funnily enough, they call them public schools there, but they're actually, which was very, very academically brilliant and rigorous, but was quite rigid. And of course, meantime, all my holidays were in Canada, and we're talking the late 60s, early 70s, and I was listening to Neil Young and Joni Mitchell and the Grateful Dead, and, letting my hair down and out in the summers. And then I was putting on this uniform and tie and everything, in this school that, that was another area where I was doing a sort of, not quite changing mid-Atlantic, as I kind of flew over, but I was doing a cultural negotiation. And I think it's made me very aware of what translation is, how the same thing can be cared about, but in different tones and language. Even the English language itself is kind of different in the two places. Luckily, I've always loved language. I've always been delighted in turns of phrase, whether they were Canadian turns of phrase or Scottish. But I had that to my parents as well, because my mother is very Scottish and my father's, a Yorkshireman. So I had rich linguistic and cultural variations from there as well. So it all kind of goes into the meld in the end. But to go back to your comment about Western things, as opposed to that formative African childhood, I think of Africa as a place of gathered circles, of community, of song, of adventure, of being allowed to take part in things, of hearing, hand clapping and drumming and songs and stories passed around, even if I didn't understand the language. So whereas, the West was all about your individual attainment and where you can get and being competitive with each other and stuff like that. And there may be a place for that, in order to achieve a certain kind of academic excellence, but it's only one aspect of life. And I think I've been, to some degree, that African childhood sort of inoculated me, I hope, against the worst excesses of the sort of competitive, individualistic materialism. But I had that not only from that, I had that from fairy stories. My mother told me great fairy stories and the Arthurian stories and myths and legends and things. So and of course my father had that stuff from the classics. So, I could never look at a tree, either from my African or from my poetic childhood, and think of it as just a big vegetable with, doing photosynthesis. It was always a living green spirit of some kind for me, and of course, that's biblical as well. That's there in the Psalms. It's there. And the trees of the field shall clap their hands. So I think in a curious way, even pagan other cultures, in their sense of the spiritual rushing through the material, can get us. They're not, obviously there are unique things about the biblical viewpoint that we want to highlight and share. But sometimes I think the way of seeing the world, you can be given your Bible back by people who read it.
It's interesting.
It was written.
It's interesting hearing you talk about your school years being very rigid. And I'm struck by how many artists, recording artists, rock stars primarily, but others, that had a profound impact. And in many respects, they were a malcontent. I think of a great Bruce Springsteen song called Growing Up, where he sings about school, where he says, they said, sit down, and I stood up. Is that relevant to your?
It is to some degree. I was a bit of a sort of rebel, certainly towards the end of my sort of school days, but my school was very concerned about academic standards. And in a sense, as long as you were good at something, I was never good at sport or anything like that, but I was very good at writing English essays. And they knew I was likely to win a scholarship to Cambridge. And that was more important to them than anything else. So I got away with slightly longer hair, and I got away with a certain sassiness. And for me, the music, talking about rock musicians, the musicians was the great thing. When I would really be cooped up in this boarding house, and I would get out my Neil Young records, and the band, and I would play that music in this little basement room where we had a record player, and suddenly I would be back, at those sort of summer music festivals in Canada where I felt a great freedom.
Where did poetry then come into your life? You've talked about being a gifted writer. Obviously, you're a gifted poet. What age? When did this all begin to make sense to you?
So I think there are sort of two ways of answering that, really. In one sense, without my almost knowing that it was poetry or a special thing written down, the poetry was there very early, mainly through my mother. Mm-hmm. My mother had a extraordinarily retentive memory. I mean, I have one too. People are surprised how I can just recite a poem if I need it. But my mother had it even more so. So when she didn't sit me down in a corner and say, take out a big book and say, now this is poetry, it's good for you. It was quite the opposite. So for example, we used to travel back and forth. My mother wouldn't fly, so we used to travel back and forth from Africa to England when my dad was on leave each year by sea. It would take 2 or 3 weeks. I'd be with my mother and my sister. And when the boat was leaving and the beautiful wake of the boat was spreading out and the land receding, we'd stand on the stern of the ship and my mother would say, the fair breeze blew, the white foam flew, the furrow followed free. We were the first that ever burst into that silent sea. And I loved it. I knew now that's a bit from Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner. And I was later in my mature years to spend 3 years of my life writing a huge book about that poem. But it was already in my blood, So my mother recited poetry, sang songs from Scotland. And often, whatever we were looking at, she would have a poem for it. I remember, and again, another time on board the ship, when this was still used to be these little trading schooners off the coast of Africa, not because people were being nostalgic about sail, but because they couldn't afford engines and they were still using these old boats. And I remember seeing this white-sailed ship, and said to Mum, it's a beautiful, beautiful sailing boat, Mum. I wonder where it's going. And my mother, put her arm around me, looked out of the boat and said, whither, O splendid ship, thy white sails crowding, leaning across the bosom of the urgent west, that fearest nor sea rising nor sky clouding, whither away, fair rover, and what thy quest? Suddenly my question had been taken up into this gorgeous language. So I was aware of that, but I didn't know it was a thing called poetry. But when I became a teenager and was having a very hard time at school and was looking for my own kind of inner world and escape, I discovered, as it were, for myself, the poetry of John Keats. I went to see Keats's house in Hampstead Heath, and I had a kind of epiphany there reading. I was about 16, reading the Ode to Nightingale on the wall there, just looking out at the very windows where the tree was that the nightingale sang, you know, where it was written. And I just thought, oh my goodness, I had no idea that this is how it's done. You write it out like that. It's got, you know, it's just, I suddenly saw it. And we had a good English teacher who was teaching us about meter and rhyme and showed us how iambic pentameter worked. And I suddenly thought, you know, I could do this. And for a long time, I was playing like, if you can imagine it, it's like Keatsian air guitar. You know, it's like when you're at a gig and, you know, Eric Clapton is there and you're stood at the back with nothing in your hands, just kind of going diddly diddly and hoping, you know, you want to be that. So I was kind of mouthing up, and I wrote loads of very, very sub-Keatsian, gushy, you know, literally, you know, full of archaisms, you know, quaffs and doths and these and that. It was unpublishable. But I was trying it out and finding out the sounds. And so I kind of kept that secret. And then I discovered that poetry and girls went together, interestingly. And I discovered that when I was first going out, that writing somebody a sonnet was a very good thing to do. And so that kept the poetry going a bit. And then when I went up to university and studied English and really got a sense of what this was and what this tradition was, and realized that somehow a lot of the music had been left behind, that since C.S. Eliot, poetry had become much more free verse and introverted and obscure. And I thought, nobody is still singing the song that Keats sang. Nobody else is doing this. They've like abandoned that. And obviously you can't write as though you were living in the 19th century. But I thought maybe I could find that sound again, but in a contemporary way. So I began to take poetry much more seriously in my sort of early 20s. And I wrote quite a lot then, but didn't really get any of it published except in the odd university magazine. And then I became a school teacher, and it was quite difficult to write poetry. I wrote comic songs for, you know, staff parties, but because the sheer level of work. And it was only when I began to realize I might have a vocation to priesthood, and I was working part-time on a PhD about John Donne, the great poet and preacher, and Lancelot Andrewes, and how they influenced the poetry of T.S. Eliot. And in John Donne and later in George Herbert, I encountered these characters who were both priests and poets in the Church of England. They took both sides of that seriously. Their vocations worked together. And as I went to theological college myself, I began to wonder whether I might take the poetry out again after hardly writing any as a teacher. And that's where I gradually began to hone this thing where, in a sense, my life as a priest and my life as a poet could go together. But it's still quite a long apprenticeship. Although, fortunately, you know, my poetry is getting known and selling reasonably well and so on. I had poems in magazines and things, but I didn't publish. I did the odd little chapbook. But I didn't publish my first full proper collection by a known publisher, you know, proper published book, until 10 years ago when Sounding the Seasons came out.
I've got it right here. I love the book. It's wonderful.
So it's been quite a sort of late flowering, if you like, as a professional poet. But I would say that poetry was a great love of my life, consciously, since that day in Keats's house when I was, 16 or 17. It would have been about 1975, I guess.
Well, it's striking that both you and C.S. Lewis, poetry in a small way, but in a large way as well, brought you into faith.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I really love the way, you know, in Surprised by Joy, you know, Lewis talks about that moment reading George MacDonald on the train, and he talks about crossing a frontier. I mean, what he says effectively in that book is that, I suppose, in a way, my imagination was baptized before I was, and the rest of me just took a little bit longer to catch up. And that was very much the case. I had part of the whole trauma of being at school and away from home, and it led to a crisis of faith. And although I'd been great privilege of being brought up in a Christian household, part of my rebellion against everything which school itself inculcated included rebellion against the faith I was brought up in. And I tried very hard between the ages of about 14 and 20 to be a kind of hard-boiled atheist, a reductive atheist, and, you know, believe it, that theoretically there was a meaningless material explanation of everything, and that what we thought of as soul and truth and value were just a wispy epiphenomenon, you know, accidentally thrown up by the unwinding of a selfish gene, that kind of thing. The difficulty, and so I rejected the Christian faith as not the case. But then I kept on having what I recognized were moments like being surprised by joy, those stabs of joy, and they all happened with poetry. And particularly when I had this experience in Keats's house reading the Ode to a Nightingale, it was very difficult to maintain that moment was just a piece of biochemistry and no different from any other pieces of biochemistry. You know, something mysterious and transmaterial was being disclosed, albeit through the materiality of the poem. But I didn't really know what to do with that. So by the time I came up to Cambridge, I was probably more of an agnostic than an atheist. And then I tried for a while the idea that whilst Christianity might not be actually true, I tried the idea that it was psychologically true, that, as it were, a story of creation, fall, and redemption is part of the pattern of the way we are. We've all lost a paradise. We all need a redeemer. And I was using Christian poetry, which was moving me more and more deeply, as a kind of substitute religion. I was trying to have my cake and eat it too. Do you know what I mean? Have the imaginative and spiritual compensation of faith without the commitment or the interference with, you know, sort of sex and drugs and rock and roll, you know, and that wouldn't wear. You know, in the end, you can't do that. In the end, you have to say, if this is psychologically true, but not actually true, why is it psychologically true? What's the case against it being actually true? What might, you know, and then I was reading quite a lot of good theology as background to the medieval literature I studied. And I read St. Augustine's Confessions, which is one of those breaking books. Yeah. And one thing you can never say after reading St. Augustine's Confessions is you can never say Christians are dumb. Do you know what I mean? You can't say that this isn't an intellectually respectable faith. And then, of course, I discovered that C.S. Lewis, whom I'd loved for the Narnia books as a kid, and whose literary criticism I regarded as the best I could find, I discovered that he'd written theology as well. And I began to seriously address some of the arguments that he himself advanced in Mere Christianity and other books, and Miracles and the Problem of Pain and so on. I began to realize that Christianity might actually be the case, and that believing it to be the case and thinking about life accordingly was not intellectual suicide. And the other thing that I think kept me away from a full, I mean, I needed in the end a direct motion of God in my soul, and that happened, you know, and there was a moment of conversion and I realized he was there. But the preparation for that, in one sense, imaginatively, I was already there because Spencer, Milton, Herbert, Donne, everybody I loved was a Christian, you know. But one of the things that helped me enormously, and this was directly from Lewis, and I reread shortly before my reconversion, I reread the Narnia books as an adult and read them alongside the Gospels and the dialogues of Plato, and really began to think, my goodness, this all makes sense. But one of the things that had kept me from taking the final step and saying to God, yes, I believe you're there, and yes, I believe you meet me in Christ, was the fear that this would be the end of thought, you know, that you say, tick the box, I'm a Christian now, I believe the creed, and you stop thinking and developing and discovering. And of course, the great mantra, if you like, of the last battle is further up and further in. This is not an end, it's a beginning. And I remembered Augustine saying in the Confessions and also in the City of God, credo ut intelligam, I believe in order to understand. And once I grasped that Christianity was a starting point for a complete new rediscovery of what it is to be human and what's going on in God's world and how poetry works and everything, that Christianity had something to do with all of that and was a place from which to rediscover the world rather than a terminus at which you arrived and then never gave it another thought. You know, that was very helpful to me and helped me to cross over the boundary, as it were.
This is exactly a conversation, if I could have had, with C.S. Lewis. It's so similar in the paths that you two have traveled.
I really feel a tremendous sense of kinship with him. And I often have imaginary conversations with him. Like I'm walking along and thinking, I imagine Lewis beside me. And I know his writings well enough to imagine the kind of things he might say. And the way he always asks you to rephrase something, or, you know, consider that, or, you know, and yeah, so I do feel, you know, I'm immensely grateful for his existence.
Well, and you have a family connection, your father-in-law.
Yeah, well, exactly. And in fact, I'm just getting some tobacco. Yeah, this was extraordinary. I mean, my father-in-law was my wife's father was a student at Magdalen in the 30s, reading English, and Lewis was his tutor, and they got on very well. And I didn't know anything about this at all. I mean, Maggie hadn't mentioned it to me when we were courting. And it was only when Maggie and I had got serious enough to think, you know, I wanted to propose to her, and we had made that agreement ourselves. But it was quite an old-fashioned household. And I thought I ought to do the proper thing and ask her father for her hand in marriage. You know, I know we would do that now, but it was a politeness in those days. And he and I would often retire to his study and talk, you know, while Maggie and her mother were talking on those occasions that I visited her family. And the first of those visits, when I was very nervous and, you know, I didn't know if I was going to pass the port the right way or, you know, hold the sherry glass correctly. I was stood with him having a sherry, you know, in his study, and I happened to quote a bit of Milton, and he quoted the next bit. And I said to him, I love that passage. And it was C.S. Lewis who really helped me to understand how good it is. And he said, oh, yes, Lewis helped me with that too. I remember him telling me that unless you read this aloud, you'll never understand it. I said, what? You know, and I'm like, when I said Lewis helped me, I meant I sat down and read the preface to Paradise Lost.
Yeah.
So then, of course, you know, we got on like a house on fire, and it discovered that I liked all the same poetry that he liked, mainly because my tastes had been formed by Lewis through books, and his tastes had actually been formed by Lewis. So after that, he discovered that there was somebody at last. He decided not to be, although he got a first, and we've got a lovely personal letter to him from Lewis telling him about his first-class degree, and inviting him to come to dinner sometime and so on. And in fact, when Maggie was a little girl and discovered the Narnia books, he said, oh, C.S. Lewis, that's my old tutor. So he wrote to Lewis and said, my little girl is enjoying your books. Lewis was at Cambridge by that time. And Lewis wrote back to him and said, oh, you know, if you'd like to come to dinner at Magdalen, this is obviously much later, this isn't in the early 60s, you know, come to Magdalen in Cambridge and have dinner, and you can bring your little girl's books and I'll happily sign them for you. So that was all set up. And then it was postponed because Lewis was unwell. And then, of course, Lewis died in November of 63. So that never happened. But anyway, the nice thing was, because he knew that I loved the same poetry and for the same reasons, he loved it when I called, because we would just shut ourselves in his study with glasses of sherry and talk poetry. And I thought, well, now's my chance. So I got us into a really good conversation about Milton's Comus. And while we were in the midst of it, I said, oh, by the way, sir, I was wondering if I might have your daughter's hand in marriage. And he said, oh, yes, of course. Now, the thing about Comus is this. So I thought, oh, you know, thank you, Jack. You know, not only...
Did you like Lewis's poetry?
I wasn't aware of it as an undergraduate.
Most are not. Most are not.
You know, I mean, Lewis's picture was in the English faculty because he's a previous head of the faculty and professor of medieval and Renaissance literature. He was there. He was a figure, but obviously he was a figure against whom lots of other people had reacted. So he didn't feature highly in the curriculum, and his poetry was never mentioned at all. And I came across his poetry just by picking up a secondhand copy of Walter Hooper's edition. And I started reading it. I thought, this is really good, you know. And then I must have been talking to Michael Ward about how much I rated Lewis as a poet. And he said, well, I'm co-editing the Cambridge Companion to C.S. Lewis. Perhaps you'd like to write the chapter on Lewis as a poet, which was just heaven sent, you know. So I really studied his poetry then. And I mean, I don't think all of it is equally of the same standard. And I think, but I think Lewis in his criticism somewhere makes mention of what he calls a golden poem by a silver poet. And I think he thought James Elroy Flecker's, you know, Rose Red City, half as old as time, was a golden poem by a silver poet. And I think I would say that there are perhaps 9 or 10 really exceptional poems by Lewis, golden poems by a silver poet. I mean, the one about the one he writes to Joy when she's dying, about, you know, all I am and all you are was making my heart a bridge for me to get out of the ruin, and now the bridge is breaking. I bless you. As the ruin falls, you know, the pains you give, and more, or you know, I mean, I think one of the finest poems is the one that's called Reason in Walter Hooper's edition, though I've argued and successfully elsewhere that it shouldn't have been called that. But the one, you know, set on the soul's acropolis, the reason stands, a virgin armed, commercing with celestial light, where he compares the reason and the imagination to the two goddesses, Athene and Demeter, you know, and when it says, you know, oh, who will reconcile in me both maid and mother, who make a concord of the depth and height, who make imagination's dim exploring touch ever report the same as intellectual sight, then could I wholly say and not deceive, then could I wholly say that I believe. I mean, I think that's a very fine poem. And I've recently been thinking about Lewis as an eco-poet. His poem, The Future of Forestry, Tell Me What an Elm Is, about looking back to a time when we might have got rid of all the trees and what that tragedy would be. You know, that's extraordinary poem. So I think Lewis's reputation as a poet can only grow, really, and be enhanced.
Well, Dr. Jerry Root, Wheaton College, has a new book out. In fact, I was just looking to see if I have a handy copy. I don't have it here. He has a new book.
Neglected Lewis.
Yeah, and the Neglected Lewis. Yep.
And then I've got it. Yeah.
Yeah, good. Yeah. And you know, it's interesting hearing you talk about your poetry. I'm still struck. You have this extraordinary ability for recall. Do you have a photographic memory?
Well, not quite in the same sense that Lewis did. Lewis had literally photographic memory.
Yeah, I know that.
I have, well, T.S. Eliot has a phrase, the auditory imagination. And I have an auditory memory. That is to say, the reason why I can remember poems, and for that matter, song lyrics, is that I've spoken them out. When I like a poem, I tend to read it out loud. And once I've read something out loud, I know it.
Once? Twice?
Well, sometimes it would seem only once. Sometimes, you know, it's more than that. I don't necessarily know that I know a poem until I need it. So I can remember, you know, I discovered that I knew Yeats's Song of the Wandering Angus, just walking one evening with someone in a beautiful twilight. And I said, moth-like stars are flickering out. And then I suddenly, you know, I sort of suddenly recalled, you know, I went out to the hazelwood because a fire was in my head, and I cut and picked the hazel wand and hooked a berry on a thread. And when white moths were on the wing and moth-like stars were flickering out, you know, I dropped the berry.
That's powerful poem, yeah.
It's an astonishing poem, you know, especially that lovely thing at the end, you know, which I used to recite I discovered as a young man. I was walking in romantically in the twilight with someone at the time. And now I'm an older man. Now I understand that final verse, though I am old with wandering through hollow lands and hilly lands, I will find out where she has gone and kiss her lips and take her hands and walk along long dappled grass and pluck till time and times are done, the silver apples of the moon, the golden apples of the sun, you know.
Yeah. You know, your poetry has been, I'm going to read this, has been characterized as modern day metaphysical poems and psalms. And that's a term. Metaphysical is a term that Samuel Johnson described a loose group of 17th century poets. What does metaphysical mean?
Yeah, so the metaphysical poets in that sense are particularly John Donne and George Herbert. I always thought metaphorical would have been a better word than metaphysical, because what characterized their poetry was their ability to take an ordinary everyday thing, a pair of compasses, you know, a window, something like that, and see in it rich poetic possibilities. You know, take an ordinary, I mean, Herbert has a phrase, heaven in ordinary, and he has another verse where he says, a man that looks on glass, on it may stay his eye, or if he pleaseth through it pass, and then the heavens espy. And it's the capacity of those poets to take something sometimes it's something out of the scientific world, sometimes it's just out of the furniture of a house, whatever it is, and suddenly see that it's a vehicle for talking about something much richer and deeper. So I think, and that particular way of doing it is sometimes called a metaphysical conceit, which is not conceit in the sense of the word conceited. It's a different sense of the word. It means conception or idea. So, yeah, I certainly I'm influenced by them in both form and, approach. I'm also still influenced by the Romantics in terms of the richness of sound, melody that I want in a poem.
Well, you talk about taking the common, something that has influenced you, perhaps driving to the market or wherever. Where do your inspirations come from? What strikes you? For instance, the most recent poem that you've written, what struck you?
Yeah, well, there's a very good question. I mean, all kinds of things. I mean, I'm sufficiently influenced by Wordsworth and Coleridge naturally to find images in nature just speaking more and more to me. I mean, the opening of my new David Crouse book, which is based on the Psalms, takes the image in the Psalms, blessed is the man that, he should be like a tree planted by the water. And there's a particular tree planted by the water that I walk past every day and I thought a great deal about that. And I took that idea and really ran with it and made much more of it, just the one thing of the tree by the water and what it means to stand still, what it means to raise your arms like branches, what it means to be rather than to do what, So that's a thing that happens. But sometimes there are completely other things. I mean, I'll give you a really ridiculous example. Well, not really, I mean, perhaps an unexpected example. So I wrote a poem called Cloud Hidden, which was a ballad poem about a trip to San Francisco I did once, strangely at the invitation of Jerry Garcia, who's a biographer of a beat poet and one of the last of the beats, New Ginsberg. But he wrote a very, very fine biography for Penguin of Kerouac called Memory Babe. And he'd come over to lecture in Cambridge and I set him up for a poetry reading with a jazz band. And he said, oh, come over to San Francisco and do a poetry reading with me. And I remember thinking, golly, I wanted my delicately wrought metaphysical sonnets to go down with beat thing, but it was actually great fun. But I wrote a ballad poem about that experience in which I'm also a fan of the music of the Grateful Dead. So it was another reason for being in San Francisco. And you may remember that the Dead, when they were still a young band, their tour bus was an old school bus.
Oh, yes. Famous.
And the front of it, where it would say the destination, Neil Cassidy, who'd been Dean Moriarty, he's the link between the Beats and the Dead. He was their bus driver. So Cassidy wrote on the front of this bus where the destination should be, he just wrote the word further. So when I got to San Francisco, I didn't even know where I was going. I literally rang Jerry Garcia from the airport and I said, so what do I do now? And he said, you can get a bus right into Marin County where I am. Just go outside and take the Rainbow Bus. I thought, what? I thought, well, I am talking to a poet. Like, is this a metaphor? No, he says, like, literally, take the Rainbow Bus. So I wrote a poem which began, I flew to San Francisco and took the Rainbow Bus, further into otherness, further into us, further into ecstasy, further into pain, further than those acid tests and all this acid rain. I climbed the stairs.
Yes.
So do you know what I mean? Just that little memory of a photo I'd once seen of the word further on a bus became a metaphor for me about a whole poetic journey.
Well, I'm going to read a poem here in a minute, but you remind me of two of the best books I've ever read, and I read them back to back. One of them is Carac's On the Road. Yeah. But I read The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test first, which was a great primer, for On the Road.
Absolutely.
Everything that you've just talked about. So you just lit up your pipe, and out of your Parable and Paradox, one of my favorite poems. Your poems are so approachable. They speak to me, and I don't read poetry as much I probably read it far more in high school because I had to write it. But your smoke rings from my pipe, and I'll just read the opening stanza. All the long days, weariness is done. I'm free at last to do just as I will. Take out my pipe, admire the setting sun, practice the art of simply sitting still. Thank God I have this briar bowl to fill. I leave the world with all its hopeless hype, its pressures and its every ringing till, and let it go in smoke rings from my pipe. And I love that. And when I smoke my pipe, I got to tell you, I've read this poem out loud to my wife, and she'll go, again? I'll say yes.
Yeah.
It speaks to me. And where you were smoking your pipe and you decided I'm picking up pen and paper?
Yeah, I was in my little hut. I'm not in it now because although the sun's just shining in now rather nicely, it's been quite a cold spring. And so it's not quite warm enough to go out there and sit, for long enough to write poetry. But I sit there in my hut in the summer, and I can smoke very freely there because there's no question of, the smoke in the atmosphere or whatever. And especially on a summer evening, I mean, that's the setting of that poem, is a summer evening, quite a long day, come home from college. I've loaded up the pipe. I always have pen and paper there. I sat there and blew some smoke rings, and I thought, I'm going to write a ballad. I'm going to just come back to this phrase, smoke rings from my pipe. And I sat in the hut and wrote it there. It's called the Temple of Peace.
Your hut. Yes.
Writing hut.
We're going to finish with part of a poem that's there. If you could turn your computer just a touch, because the smoke has created this halo. There you go. Much better. This halo effect with that beautiful sun coming through. And, I'll read a quote from Archbishop Canterbury, retired, Rowan Williams, who said that and he paid you the highest compliment. Your poetry offers deep resources for prayer and meditation to the reader. And I thought, boy, that if that doesn't sum it up. Now, I have another question about, we could spend literally all day on your poetry. You wrote a poem called Imagine. And the first thing that came to my mind was John Lennon's, epic.
Yeah, but I was partly riffing.
Yeah, I was just saying, did you do that to riff? Yeah.
Yeah.
So for the viewer, Lennon's.
Oh, no, yeah. Which one? I've got two poems called Imagine. There's one that begins, Imagine a New Natural Philosophy.
No, this one is Do Not Judge.
Oh, yeah. No, that I was deliberately riffing on Lennon.
Yes.
I thought I might get a cease and desist from the Lennon.
I'm surprised, even though you did have an encounter with a Beatle. It's from Parables. And Lennon's, for our viewers, Lennon's classic song ends, you may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us and the world will live as one. But you concluded yours, Imagine, with forgive and you yourselves will be forgiven. What if we walked it together on this path? What if the whole world laid aside its wrath? All things were done on earth as though in heaven, and as though the heart's dark knots were all undone, as though this dreamer weren't the only one. A great comparison to a secular poem, to one that is steeped in faith. What prompted you to write a riff on?
I'll tell you what. I mean, I have ambivalent feelings about that song.
Yeah,
I think with the Lennon song. Let's talk about that. He's a genius. I think it's a classic song, but I think there's a contradiction in terms right from the outset in that song when he says, "Imagine there's no heaven." Right? Mm-hmm. It's easy if you try. No hell below us, above us only sky. Now, if you really listen to that song, when he's longing for a brotherhood of man, no need for greed or hunger, imagine all the people living life in peace. What is he doing? He's imagining heaven. In fact, I don't think you can use the word imagine without summoning the word heaven, because the heaven that God has in wait for us, which is the full fruit of the divine imagination, he's imagined a heaven on earth for us. He imagined this beautiful world for us. He imagined us into it. He breathed us into being. We screwed it up. We took his heavens and started turning them into hell. Possibility and came into them to redeem it in a great, brilliant, poetic, imaginative act. He entered his own creation and became one of us and started to undo the heart's dark knots. from within, in the atonement, and calls us. I mean, all the parables of Jesus, and particularly the Beatitudes, are an attempt to help us to imagine heaven, and to imagine heaven so vividly that we start living from it now, so that we could be like Puddleglum, who said, I don't care if you tell me there is no Narnia, I'm going to live like a Narnian anyway. But it's funny how I can imagine something better than your funny little world, So in a curious way, even though I recognize and I want to keep to the integrity that John Lennon, whose head is atheist, although his heart was never atheist, John Lennon with his head is trying to say, we'd be a lot better off without religion. And that's simply because, and I'm not denying that he says that in that song, but that's because the form of organized religion that fell on him with a great clattering weight in his childhood was not helpful. He grew up in circumstances which led him, not unreasonably, to believe that Christianity was part of the problem and not part of the solution. So I recognize the head is trying to do that. But in that song, John Lennon's heart is already on the side of heaven. He's already asking us, in fact, to imagine heaven, even as he says, imagine there's no heaven.
Well said. I'm going down a slippery slope here, because you told me an incredible story of running into the Fab Four. I don't know if that's something that you,
but yeah,
if you would like to share or not.
It was a very strange experience. I was at school, it was fairly shortly after I'd got to this English boarding school, and I couldn't go home to Canada for all the holidays. It's a bit like that Harry Potter scenario, where Harry can't go home. It's stuck in this. There's a very beautiful country house where the borders were. It was mainly a big day school, but there was a small boarding house. And outside of term times and around, and just even sometimes during terms, in fact, this was during a term time, they used to hire, it had beautiful grounds and an ornamental lake, and they used to hire it out, and it was forbidden. It was like you're out of bounds to go there. And we used to go on cross-country runs that went all the way around this thing. But I discovered that if I was at the back of the run, the master would never notice. And I could nip out, go through, climb over the fence, get into this beautiful set of ornamental lakes. And there was a lovely grotto and sort of cave by the lake and branches out over the lake. And I discovered this quite early on, and used to have like a secret stash of kind of cigarettes and beer bottles and stuff in there. And I would nip out from the cross-country run, go and, even if it only gave me 10 minutes all by myself in my little cave. And then I could go back across. And because all the other kids were running all the way around, I could pick up the trail, at the end, and nobody knew I'd done it. So that was what I used to do. And one day I was doing that, I was coming along, and I came round to my secret place in this, by this lake, and I heard these voices, but I was running, of course, because I wanted to maximize the time I had in my little cave. So I could hardly stop myself. And I literally came around the corner and ran into somebody. And when I picked myself and said, sorry, he turned around, it was Paul McCartney. I mean, it was Paul McCartney was right there, and Linda was just beside him. And it turned out that it was the whole of Wings there doing the photo shoot for that album, that with that lovely rustic cover, they're all sitting on a branch, and the school had obviously set that up, but obviously not told any of the boys. And so he said, what are you doing here? And I said, without thinking, I said, I'm skiving off, which is schoolboy slang for, doing a bunker. And he grinned from ear to ear and said, oh, another skiver, and then he introduced me to Linda, and, I started. And then, so instead of going in and having my little stash, I just talked to Paul McCartney in Wings. And then I said, I have to rush off. And, he said, fine, off you go. So, and I wondered if I dreamt it, but then obviously the school did know that he was there, because they published an official photo of him with the proper school captain, the head boy, standing with him, and they did a little thing that he'd been there, but nobody knew that I'd actually just bumped into him.
Well, they actually did a music video from that shoot. They did that was, and it aired, I believe it was aired on the BBC.
Oh, right. Well, I don't think I was that.
No. Fortunately not, or you would have been restricted.
Oldham House. It was the place, the name of the place. Yeah.
Well, we've had almost an hour here, and I feel I could go on and on and on. It's just a joy to be with you, Malcom, again. And I hope our viewers have enjoyed this as much as I have. It's a conclusion of the entire series that we recorded when you were here with Michael Ward in 2018. We would love to have you come back. And I would be mistaken if I didn't ask you to recite part of your poem from your Temple of Peace, which is where you work and when it's warm. And it's a poem that I was slightly familiar with, but after doing the research before we did this interview, I too have it taped up in my office. It is a wonderful poem.
This is Wendell Berry's poem.
It is Wendell Berry's poem, How to Be a Poet. And I'm wondering, before we leave, if you could read a few of the stanzas.
Yeah. So this is the, I've just brought it to the hut. I thought this is the little bit of paper that I have pinned up in the hut. And it's his poem, How to Be a Poet, brackets, to remind myself. And the reason why it's in my hut is that I regard this as, almost a sacred text. It's just superb. And of course, it starts with the words makeup. I mean, I sometimes think I never get past line 3 of this poem before I realize I haven't done it yet, because that is my place to sit down. So let me read it to you. This is what I look at before I sit down and write poetry. How to Be a Poet, to Remind Myself, by Wendell Berry. Make a place to sit down. Sit down. Be quiet. You must depend upon affection, reading, knowledge, skill, more of each than you have, inspiration, work, growing older, patience. For patience joins time to eternity. Any readers who like your work doubt their judgment. Breathe with unconditional breath the unconditioned air. Shun electric wire. Communicate slowly. Live a 3-dimensioned life. Stay away from screens. Stay away from anything that obscures the place it is in. There are no unsacred places, only sacred places and desecrated places. And I have that in the place. And I love, later on in that poem, he says a beautiful thing. He says, try to make a poem that does listen to the silence, accept what comes from it, make what you can of it. And then he says, try to make a poem that does not obscure the silence from which it comes. That's just superb. And in a way, my own poem, The Singing Bowl, begin the song exactly where you are, remain within the world of which you're made, call nothing common in the earth or air. That's my response to that poem. And that's a key poem for me.
Well, it's wonderful. Thank you. I'm sorry I didn't have my pipe here. I would have lit up as well. I did have a good British tea.
Yes, I've got a good British tea here and a nice British tea mug. Yeah.
Absolutely. Don't be a stranger. We would welcome you back absolutely anytime, particularly after this madness of COVID is over.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it would be great. Yeah. I'm looking forward to traveling again when I can. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Malcom.
Okay, great. Lovely.
Thank you, Malcom. And thank you for traveling with me on the Lewis Festival Scholar Series over these 5 episodes of Lewis and Dante's Divine Comedy. To stay informed and catch the next season, please be sure to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcast app. That way, the next season will automatically be downloaded. Or simply sign up for the e-news on the front page of the Lewis website, and that is at cslewisfestival.org. It doesn't get any easier than that. We are ecstatic that indeed there will be a festival this coming September along the beautiful shores of Lake Michigan in Petoskey, Michigan. It all kicks off Friday, September 10th, as we welcome back as our keynote speaker, best-selling author Philip Yancey. Again, please visit our website, cslewisfestival.org, for all the month-long details, including Philip's 3 speaking engagements that weekend. Most of our events are free and open to the public. This entire podcast has been made possible by the C.S. Lewis Festival in Petoskey and its generous sponsors. I'd like to thank the festival, as well as podcast producer Zach Smith of Hands Media and recording engineer Peter Monti. On behalf of the Lewis Festival, thank you for listening. Here's to Narnia and the North.